one of the objects of bringing the evolutionary leaders together is to inspire collaboration among them. And so the next presentation that you're going to hear is from 3 of our evolutionary leaders. You've already met Duane Elgin, and he has been working over the past year or 2, 3 years already. Oh my goodness, we are maturing as a circle, aren't we? With Lynnaea Lumbard, who is a transformational psychologist, activist, seminar leader, philanthropist, and fellow interfaith minister. And Jeff Vander Clute, who is part of the Compassionate Action Network and the Happiness Initiative. And he is one of our new evolutionary leaders who's come on board this year. And they are going to tell us about the new transition stories. So welcome, Lynnaea and Duane and Jeff.
The Evolutionary Leaders Group came together to bring in many, many different dimensions of the whole process of the Great Transition. And the one that we have been working on is really the level of story, the larger story. Ocean really brought us into the what can you do in your next mouthful. And we're going to talk just a little bit about the broader aspect of what story we are in. If we take for a given, which I think in this room we can, that we are in a great transition, what are the stories that take us through this? I want to read a little quote from Thomas Berry, who is one of my early inspirations. It's all a question of story. We are in trouble just now because we do not have a good story. We are in between stories. The old story, the account of how the world came to be and how we fit in it, is no longer functioning properly, and we have not yet learned the new story. I've sat with that quote for many, many, many years. And when Duane and I and Jeff first got together, we were looking at, well, what are the stories? Is there a new story? And actually, we began to realize that Duane had already written the core new story, which is that we live in a living universe. As one of our young colleagues said to us when she was describing how she talked to her friends, well, would you rather live in a dead universe or a living universe? And the story of our culture over the last few hundred years from the scientific revolution is that we live in a mechanistic, dying, decaying clock that is running down. But if we start to look at what if we took on that we lived in a living universe, what would change for us? How would we be with each other in a different way? And we began to look at, out of that, what are the stories of life? Because as I researched for many years, the core story of our culture, of how we all change, is actually the apocalypse. And surely there must be a better story than just blowing us up with lots of rivers of blood and a few of us getting to go to heaven and the rest of us just kind of going down with the earth. That was not a story that seemed to work for me. So we began to research over time, what stories does life tell us? If we're in a living universe, how does life change? How does life evolve? What do we know about how life changes? And probably most of you, all of you, are familiar with the butterfly story. That was the first one that occurred to me and one that I've worked with for lots of years. And most of you probably had the experience of kind of, in a kind of psychological way or belief way, feeling like you're crawling on a leaf, and then having an experience of your world starting to collapse. And we're all having the experience of a lot of our worlds starting to collapse or dissolve. And some of you may have had the experience of feeling like you retreat or you go inside, or for a period of time your life is like being in a cocoon until some new things start to emerge, which are now actually scientifically called imaginal cells. And if we begin to be with the imaginal cells, some whole new process begins to develop. And that story of moving from a caterpillar to a butterfly is one story of transformation in life. For me, my favorite is actually the story that Bruce Lipton will go into a little more in a few minutes, of how cells evolve. And the whole process of how we started with single cells, actually started before that, but I'll start there, and moved into multicellular organisms. One of our wonderful ELs, as we call ourselves, David Gershon, talked about the Cambrian jump, when we went from single cells to multi-cells, and that was a key time in our evolution. And for me, we're now in a time when we're moving from just multicellular organisms to, in a sense, multi-organ systems. We all can feel that in our own bodies. We've got liver, we've got teeth, we've got blood, we've got brains. What if all of humanity is moving to a place of becoming a super organism, when each of us have a place, each of us have something to bring to the table? These stories we began to collect in a whole series of stories that are on our website, and we have some brochures in the back of the room called the GreatTransitionStories.org, or just Great Transition Stories will take you to it, to begin to list where are these stories coming from. And we discovered they're all coming from life and the processes of life that begin to give us a clue not only of what story we're in, because stories hold us, but also what do we do in relationship to that? If we take the story that Bruce is talking about of becoming a superorganism, the obvious thing we do is we begin to collaborate. And with that, I'll let Duane begin to talk about what we're doing with the stories themselves. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lynnaea. This has been a 3-year adventure so far, and it's becoming very exciting the further we get into it. Let me just say this about the stories. They come from many sources: biology, technology, cosmologies, psychology, and so on. But these are all stories that come out of our direct life experience as human beings, and they have 4 core qualities. First of all, they're universal. Everyone around the world should know these stories. They should know them out of their direct experience. Secondly, they're simple. These stories should be able to be told within 1 sentence or less. Thirdly, they're emotionally powerful. We care about them. And fourthly, they evoke our higher potentials. So let me give you just a couple of quick examples further. Is humanity growing up? Just 4 or 5 words. Well, people say, well, I don't know, we look like we're in our teenage years to me. I say, golly, that's good news, because we're just a short ways from our adulthood. All right, is that universal? Absolutely it's universal. Is it simple? Totally simple. Is it emotionally powerful? Anyone that's had adolescence, you know it's emotionally powerful. Is it going somewhere to a higher potential? You bet, if we move into our adulthood. So there's another example of a story of great transition. So, who cares? That's the next question. Who cares if we're in great transition? Who cares about a new story? And after 3 years of work, we went out on the road. And we've been, for example, I've spoken 4 times in Hollywood now to over 1,500 screenwriters, producers, directors about the abysmal quality of Hollywood story making and the impoverished view that we have of the future. And as Lynnaea was saying, a collapse is not a story, it's the end of stories. That's it. That's the end of stories. So we've reached out to Hollywood, I can't say with a great deal of success. We reached out to the business community, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. And they're saying, look, if an economy is truly alive and local, it must have some story that holds it together. What's the social glue that holds those farmers and those merchants together into a cohesive whole? They're not just competing with one another. There's a cooperative ecology of relationships. So there's another story. Another story would come out of education. I'm just finishing now teaching doctoral students at Prescott College, using stories of great transition so they can go back to their constituents with new tools for transformation. Let me give you a quick couple of examples. One of the persons is a woman working for Catholic Relief Services in Guatemala. She's saying, look, these kids have no hope for the future. She's saying, well, let's translate these stories into Spanish, bring it down to an 8th grade level, and begin to bring hope back into the future of these impoverished and feeling desperately hopeless young people. Another woman is an architect. She has more degrees than she needs. And she is tired of architecture, green architecture. What she wants to know is, why build the building in the first place? What's the story for building that building? Once we know the story for why that building should be there, then we know the architecture that will express that. Now, those are just a few examples, and I could give you many more. But the point is, it is hitting the ground. We are getting traction on stories of great transition. Not just minor stories of transition, but the great transition of the entire human family coming into a new sense of community and a new sense of possibility. And with that, I want to turn to Jeff, who is also working on the worldly expression of this in some really exciting and important ways. Jeff.
Thank you, Duane. All right, sound check. So great transition stories in action. Stories are strategic. We're at this tipping point, which means trim tabs really matter. And the stories that we tell really matter because they encapsulate, they encode our understanding of the world, they inform our sense of possibilities for the future that we can live into together. If we believe that our story is, and our one and only story is, the downward spiral of doom and despair and devastation, then we're likely to tip in that direction. But there are so many other stories. The Great Transition Stories website has 13. We could easily have 30. We're now focusing on how do these stories we've told so far that are archetypal in nature actually get expressed in the world? How do we live into these stories? And the good news is we don't have to start living into them. They're happening now, and they're emerging from the grassroots strongly all over the place. Even though Hollywood may be slow to start telling these stories, the truth is there are millions of people who in their own lives are not only telling them, maybe discovering them, maybe stumbling a little bit along the way, but actually living them. So I can give you some examples that I'm personally involved in. Lynnaea spoke about the butterfly metaphor, the metamorphosis. There's a stage along the way where imaginal cells emerge. They're the first new cells, and a few of them get killed, but then they start to be produced more and more rapidly, and they find one another, and the new organism forms. So new stories very interested in what are the new organisms that are beginning to form now. I was scanning the horizon for the last 3 years, asking that question. I came upon something called the Compassionate Action Network. I came upon something called the Happiness Initiative. I helped to start something called Thriving Communities. So I'll take those in order. In 2008, Karen Armstrong won the TED Prize for her vision of a Charter for Compassion. Have people heard of the Charter for Compassion? A good number. This is a trim tab. It changes the conversation. 100,000 people have personally taken the step to affirm the Charter for Compassion, which is essentially the golden rule. And we find that in all of the world's major religions and spiritual and ethical traditions. So it is a unifier. It brings us together. It creates the possibility for this higher order unity and collaboration that could lead to a superorganism. And you'll hear a lot more about superorganisms from Bruce later. So the Charter for Compassion can be signed by individuals online at charterforcompassion.org, but some folks in Seattle had the great idea that an entire city could affirm the Charter for Compassion. So Seattle was the first city. We knew the mayor and the city council. They were very excited to be the first, and they unanimously signed as individuals and committed the city to a 10-year plan to embody compassionate action. And now we have 14 cities around the world, in Turkey, elsewhere in the Middle East, in the United States, soon India. We're getting requests just about one a day. We think by 2015 we'll have 100 cities that have affirmed the Charter for Compassion, and of course on their individual paths figuring out what that looks like for them, but starting to network to one another. So we're creating networks where representatives, practitioners from the cities can talk to one another and share wisdom and stories of how it's working for them. Just last summer, an idea bubbled up from that network to have compassion games, survival of the kindness. Once again, Seattle was the first. I happen to live there, so I'm a little partial. But it was actually the city of Louisville that challenged Seattle to prove they were even more compassionate. So a friendly, very compassionate competition. And it wasn't the Hunger Games, it was the Compassion Games, survival of the kindness. So for 1 month last fall, Seattle celebrated compassion and enacted compassion. And this year they're going to do it again. And this year there's going to be a global league of compassionate cities. So this is a new story. It's coming from the grassroots. It's unstoppable. We think we can reach 100 million people just in the next few years in one way or another. Keeping it real brief, the Happiness Initiative has an offering called the Gross National Happiness Index. In July 2011, the UN endorsed gross national happiness and other holistic measures of well-being. So not just economic, but yes, economic, and 9 other domains of well-being. We have an online survey that allows individuals and organizations and whole communities to take this assessment and see how they're doing. And then communities can compare themselves with one another, again, in a friendly way, and then come together to support their mutual growth and learning. Lastly, thriving communities. There's a pattern here of the community level becoming a unit of organizing and communities coming together to support one another. In this case, bioregionally. Thriving communities has taken root in the Pacific Northwest, and so far there are 35 communities that are participating. We have a conference series where we're exchanging the grassroots wisdom of new stories that are actually being lived with respect to agriculture, local food system. That was our first topic. This year, thriving local economy. Next year, it'll be healthcare, and then we have plenty more after that. So these are actual lived stories that are being shared and inspiring everyone throughout the network. And what I'll say about this conference is that it's not the usual format of somebody like me standing up and speaking to you as if I know something. The truth is, everyone in the room is an expert on what they do because they're living it. So our processes are allowing a mixing of all the wisdom in the room, producing higher order knowing, again, informing the emergence of this kind of superorganism in local communities and bioregionally. So you can see how stories matter. They inspire us individually, they inspire us collectively. We're at the tipping point. And in my sense is we've actually already tipped in favor of a thriving future. Thank you.